kissed. I know what I want and I know how to get it. I want to destroy passersby. I wanna be anarchy. With the help of a green screen, I'm coming to you today from CBGB, the epicenter of the New York punk scene in the 1970s. You might have noticed that my guitar playing is a little rough. The musicians of the punk scene actually couldn't play either. Or if they could, they hid that fact. Punk is anti-everything. Society, culture, government, beauty itself. It's the ultimate anti-aesthetic. The players in the punk scene were reacting against all the things that have been coming before for the last 10 years. You can think back to the psychedelic era, to the hippies, to the Beatles' last stage. All of that was something that was being given notice to, as Charlie puts it in the Buddha of Suburbia, by the arrival of the punk scene in the mid-1970s. Cultural and political change form the background of the book. Punk started pretty much simultaneously in New York and in London. At first, the New York scene was more vibrant. There you had bands playing clubs like Max's Kansas City and CBGB. The Ramones, Blondie, and Patti Smith were some of the major acts to emerge out of this world. The London scene, I would argue, though taken off a little bit later, really defined what punk meant, I think, to a lot of people by the end of punk. It brought a politics to the music that wasn't there, at least not to the same extent as it was in New York. The major band there was the Sex Pistols. Their only album, Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, released in 1977, featuring major tracks like Anarchy in the UK and God Save the Queen, shows the raw, anti-authoritarian strain pulsing in the music. John Lydon, aka Johnny Rotten, says he eventually grew out of his anarchic phase.
And by the way, I never preached anarchy. It was just a novelty in a song. I always thought anarchy was a mind game for the middle classes, really impractical.
That's where you put Russell
Anarchists can't get anywhere without motorways.
But the music still speaks against authority in a way that no music before or since has ever done. It's important to remember while reading the Buddha of Suburbia that punk erupts on the scene right when Kareem and Charlie are going through some major changes in their lives. It symbolizes changes they have to make and that England's going through as it moves towards the long right-wing prime ministership of Margaret Thatcher that was to begin in 1979, a year after the book ends.
Mrs. Thatcher out onto the doorstep.
On the 4th of May, Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister with a Commons majority of 43 seats. On arriving at Downing Street, she made one of the most memorable, if not universally well-received speeches of her prime ministerial career.
It's the greatest honour that can come to any citizen in a democracy. I know full well the responsibilities that await me as I enter the door of number 10, and I'll strive unceasingly to try to fulfil the trust and confidence that the British people have placed in me and the things in which I believe.
London's recovery from World War II and the loss of the British Empire was long and painful. Jimmy Carter said that the United States was suffering from a crisis of confidence in the 1970s because of all of the political events and economic events the U.S. had recently gone through. He said this was because of the gas shortages that caused long lines at the pump, because of the political events like Watergate, which led to the resignation of Richard Nixon, because of the Vietnam War, because of all the things that had been heaping up over the last several years that made Americans tired and worn out. But Americans had it pretty easy. For 20 years after World War II, America saw amazing economic growth. America, of course, had not been bombed except for Pearl Harbor during World War II. England, on the other hand, had to emerge from a difficult era. Its infrastructure had been destroyed by the German Air Force during the war. Southeast London was virtually destroyed during 1939 and 1940 during the Blitz. There are parts of Southeast London that by the time the action in the Buddha of Suburbia take place, still had not been repaired more than 25 years after the war. Britain's economy didn't enjoy the same improvement that the American economy did after World War II. By the 1970s, things were stagnating. Unemployment was high. Everything seemed to be a mess. Major industries like mining, especially, were undergoing severe change. During the 70s and throughout the 1980s, there was a lot of worry about what to do about the mines. All of this is in the background also of the Buddha of Suburbia. During the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher would decide to let the mines basically go belly up. She just let them fail.
I want to see no more pit closures, no more job losses.
Mr. Chairman, what we have seen in the past few weeks is not picketing at all.
1984, and a war of attrition engulfs the British coal industry. This was a year-long resistance by the bulk of the miners and their families.
He's a man, a big man, leave him walk out.
And it was a defining, deeply scarring moment in the history of British industrial relations.
By the end of the 1970s, that decision hasn't quite been made yet. But all of the political unrest, all of the economic unrest that is inherent in all of this is visible in the book. This, coupled with the effects of immigration from the former British colonies, was generating a rise in the parties of the right throughout England. In 1945, less than 10,000 of the British population was non-white. By 1970, at least 1.4 million people in England were classified as non-white. The tensions that this brought about run through the entire book. Right-wing racist groups developed. Enoch Powell, a politician who was actually in the cabinet, predicted that rivers of blood would run in the streets as a result of this changing of the British population.
In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. I can already hear the chorus of execration. How dare I say such a horrible thing? How dare I stir up trouble and inflame feelings by repeating such a conversation? My answer is that I do not have the right not to do so.
At the end of the 1970s, England would decide which way to turn at that crossroads, and the answer was sharply to the right, just as America did with the election of Ronald Reagan a year after Thatcher's rise to the prime ministership. Remember as you read The Buddha of Suburbia that it's a coming-of-age story set during a time of significant social change. I hope that knowing a little bit about these changes helps you understand the things that the major characters of the book, Kareem, Charlie, Haroon, Anwar, Jamila, are all going through.